All right, so today we're diving into abstract objects.
Ah,
And I
yes.
think as a philosopher, this is something that you've probably already been grappling with.
Absolutely.
We all sort of agree there's this distinction between abstract and concrete, but nailing it down,
Right.
getting a universally agreed upon definition is a real challenge.
Yeah, it really is. It's one of those things in philosophy where everyone agrees there's a difference, but no one can quite agree on what exactly the difference is.
It's sort of like everyone agrees there's a delicious cake, but can't agree on the recipe.
Absolutely a perfect analogy. And the interesting thing is, this lack of a single definition is really intriguing because philosophers rely on this abstract, concrete distinction all the time
Yeah.
in all different areas of philosophy, from metaphysics and epistemology
Right.
to logic, philosophy of language, you name it.
It's everywhere.
It is.
So I think for you, unpacking these different ways of characterizing abstract objects,
Yeah.
it's not just a kind of abstract intellectual exercise. It can actually really kind of deepen your understanding,
Yeah.
right, of all of these other philosophical domains as well.
Absolutely. I think it's kind of if you were to look at the foundation of a house,
Okay.
understanding how the foundation is structured
Yeah.
can tell you a lot about the stability, about the design of the entire building.
Essentially, yeah, it's like the bedrock.
Yeah.
So to kind of lay the groundwork here, I think it's helpful to maybe take a little historical detour.
Okay.
The abstract concrete distinction, it didn't always have to do with objects, right?
No, not at
Yeah.
all. I mean, you can go all the way back to ancient Greece.
Okay.
People were using these terms and they were thinking about it more grammatically. So
Good.
abstract nouns versus concrete nouns. So like beauty versus tree.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Those sorts of things.
All right.
And then later on, you have people like John Locke in the 17th century really talking about abstract ideas.
Okay.
And for Locke, the idea was we get these abstract ideas by taking concrete experiences, sensory experiences, and stripping away the particular details. So abstracting away from them.
Okay, so it's more like a psychological process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a mental process.
Interesting. So it wasn't until more recently
Yeah.
that philosophers started thinking about abstract objects.
Yeah, that's right. It really took off in the 20th century with figures like Gottlob Frege,
Right.
arguing, for instance, that numbers are neither physical nor mental.
Right. Their own thing.
They're their own thing, exactly.
Yeah.
And so this really challenges this traditional division we have.
Right, between mind and matter.
Right, the material and the mental, exactly.
Yeah.
And opens up this whole other third realm, right?
With these abstract entities.
Exactly.
So I guess then the question becomes, how do we even start to define what belongs
Right.
in this new playground?
Well, one approach, you might call it the way of example,
Okay.
which is basically you just point to things and you say,
Yeah.
this is abstract, that's concrete,
Right.
that's not very satisfying philosophically.
It seems like giving up before you even start.
It does, a little bit. Like, I can't tell you why this is abstract, but just trust me, this chair is concrete, that number's abstract.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's useful to get an intuitive grasp, but
Uh-huh.
it doesn't really give us a clear rule. For instance, I think most people would say, okay, pure sets are abstract, right?
Yeah.
What about a set with concrete members,
Yeah.
like the set of all the books in your library?
Okay, yeah.
Is that abstract?
That's where it gets kind of fuzzy.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
It's not so straight.
It's not so straightforward.
So what are some other kind of more robust ways
Yeah.
that philosophers have tried to tackle this?
One really common one is what's called the way of negation.
Okay.
So it's like defining something by saying what it's not.
Okay.
And a classic example of this is the idea that abstract objects are non-spatial
Right.
and causally inefficacious.
So if it doesn't have a location in space
Right.
and it can't cause anything to happen,
Exactly.
then it's abstract.
That's the idea.
Okay. Seems straightforward enough.
It seems that way, right?
Yeah.
But of course, as with many things in philosophy, the devil's in the details.
Sure.
So take non-spatiality. I mean, on the one hand, it seems pretty straightforward.
Right.
I mean, something like the Pythagorean theorem
Right.
doesn't seem to have a location in space.
No.
But then we get these more tricky cases like, what about an abstract artifact, like the game of chess?
Okay.
You know, it was invented
at a certain time.
at a certain time in a certain place.
It's evolved over time.
Exactly.
So it does seem like it has some temporal properties at least.
Right. It's got temporal properties. And so suddenly even something as seemingly obvious as existing outside of space gets complicated.
Right. Exactly.
And the same thing goes for causal inefficacy.
Okay.
You know, the idea that abstract objects can't cause anything to happen.
Right.
But then you get these cases like, What about fictional characters?
Okay, yeah.
We think those are abstract,
Uh-huh.
but they certainly seem to have an impact, right?
Yeah, I mean, they can evoke emotions.
Exactly. They can influence our behavior. They can
Yeah.
shape how we see the world. So,
So even if it's not a kind of direct causal impact in the physical world,
right.
it still seems like there's real impact on mind's actions.
Absolutely. So this is where even the way of negation, which seems fairly straightforward,
Right.
it pushes us to think more carefully about what these relationships between abstract objects
Yeah.
and space, time, causality,
Yeah.
what those relationships actually look like. Because they might be more complicated than we initially assume.
It's like we're starting to kind of see the contours
Right.
of this abstract landscape in a more detailed way.
Exactly.
Well, there's another way that I'm particularly curious about, the way of abstraction.
Yes.
And it seems to tie in a certain way, with how we form abstract ideas, right?
Well, I would be careful with that connection.
Okay.
Because the traditional way of abstraction was tied to a certain model of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's no longer really popular.
Yeah.
This idea that we literally strip away details from sensory experiences
Right.
to form these abstract ideas, it's not quite how it works.
It's not like I look at, 5 red apples and then suddenly redness erupts into my head.
Exactly. So modern philosophers have kind of moved away from that purely psychological picture,
Okay.
and they focus more on what are called abstraction principles.
Okay.
And these are statements that connect abstract objects to relations between concrete things.
Okay.
So a good example of this is how we define direction, right?
Yeah.
So you might say, the direction of line A is the same as the direction of line B, if and only if line A and line B are parallel.
Okay.
So we're using a concrete relationship parallelism
Right.
to define this abstract concept direction.
Gotcha. So you're grounding the abstract
Yeah,
in
exactly.
the concrete.
Exactly. And it seems to capture something important
Yeah.
about how we understand these objects, right? They're
Right.
not just floating out there. They're
Yeah.
somehow grounded. Uh-huh.
In this concrete reality through these relations.
It's like they're a high-level map
Yes.
built upon the terrain of concrete experience.
That's a great way to put it.
But then, I mean, does that make them any less real?
That's a great question. And that's one of the things that leads us to all these other ways of understanding what abstract objects are and how they exist.
Yeah.
Which is something we'll explore more in the next part of our deep dive. So we've been talking about these different ways of kind of tying abstract objects to the concrete world,
Right, yeah. Trying to ground them?
grounding them, in the relations and so on.
Yeah.
But some philosophers look at this and think this is still too much.
Okay.
It's too metaphysically heavy.
Okay.
So they propose that maybe these objects exist in a kind of less demanding, more what we might call thin kind of way.
Okay, so they're not saying they don't exist at all. They just exist differently.
Yeah, differently.
I'm trying to wrap my head around that. What does that even mean?
It's a tough one.
Yeah. To get your head around. But one way to think about it is through the work of Rudolf Carnap, a really influential philosopher of the 20th century,
Okay.
who argued that really questions about the real existence of anything, abstract or concrete,
Right.
are kind of meaningless.
Whoa. Okay, so he's really shaking things up here.
He is.
It's like ontology, the study of what exists, is a dead end.
Yeah, or at least the traditional way of thinking about it
Right.
is kind of missing the point.
Okay.
So for Carnap, he's not saying we can't talk about things existing.
Right.
But he's saying that those claims only have meaning within a specific linguistic framework.
So the context matters.
Context matters hugely, yeah.
Oh.
So to say, for example, that numbers exist, according to Carnap, is really just to say that the rules of our language allow us to talk about numbers in a consistent way.
So it's more about how we use language.
Exactly, yeah.
Less about
what's out there.
Yeah, less about this metaphysical
question of what's really out there.
So it's almost like he's shifting the debate from metaphysics to linguistics.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not, do numbers exist out there?
Right.
It's, how do they function within our system of thought and language?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So this approach, what you might call the criterion of linguistic rules, it's got some interesting consequences.
Okay.
I mean, for instance, it suggests that abstract objects exist because their existence is built into how we use language.
Okay, so they're not these mysterious entities floating around.
Right.
They're more like linguistic constructs.
Yeah, in a way.
Essential for us to think communicate,
Right.
but not necessarily real.
Yeah, not real in that traditional metaphysical sense.
Okay, interesting. So Carnap is not the only one,
No, not at all.
right, who's exploring this idea of kind of weakening existence.
Exactly. And another really fascinating approach is what's called meta-ontological minimalism.
Okay, gotta love philosophy and its isms.
Right. Another ism to add to the list.
It's exactly. So what's the gist of this one?
Well, the basic idea here is that minimalists
Okay.
argue that abstract objects exist, but they exist in a way that places very minimal demands on reality.
Okay.
So they exist, you might say,
Yeah.
just enough to make sense of our theories, our practices.
So if we can talk about it,
Yeah.
and it's logically consistent,
Yeah.
it exists.
It's not quite that simple. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not like we can just make things up.
Right.
But the idea is,
Okay.
especially for minimalists like Charles Parsons,
Okay.
Michael Resnick, Stuart Shapiro,
Yeah.
the idea is that coherence within a theory, say a mathematical theory,
Right.
is enough to ground the existence of those objects.
So it's not arbitrary invention,
Right.
but what's kind of needed
Yeah, it's what's necessary.
for our theories to work.
Exactly, for our best theories to work.
Okay, so it's almost like if this theory is true,
Right.
then these objects must exist, even if it's in this thin, minimally demanding way.
Exactly. And this ties into the notion of modal truths, truths about what's possible. So, numbers exist according to this view because it's possible to have an infinite sequence of things.
Okay.
So that possibility, even if it's never fully realized
Right.
in the concrete world,
Uh-huh.
is enough
To ground their existence.
to ground their existence. Exactly.
It's a very different picture from
That is.
just things being out there.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a much more,
Right? It's a different kind of existence.
yeah, it's a much more
Yes.
modal way of thinking about it.
This thin existence, it's almost like what's logically necessary or conceptually necessary for
Yeah.
our understanding
Absolutely.
for things to hang together.
Yeah. Very well put.
Okay, so this minimalist approach,
Right.
it leads to some really fascinating questions.
It does.
If they exist in this thin modal way, does that make them less real?
Right.
Or are they just real in a different way?
Right. And
It's a tough one.
that's a question for you to wrestle with, right?
For the listener, yeah.
For the listener, yeah, as a philosopher,
Right.
that's something that you can think about. And I think and that leads into another interesting approach, which
Okay.
we should talk about, which is Einstein Lenibo.
Lenibo, okay.
Lenibo's view. Yeah. So his view is really fascinating because it kind of tries to capture both the thinness
Okay.
and the robustness
Okay.
of these abstract objects.
Okay, so he's threading the needle here.
He is, yeah, in a way, he is. So
Okay.
his view builds on the way of abstraction principles
Uh-huh.
that we talked about, but with a really crucial twist.
Okay, what's the twist?
So he rejects the idea that those principles are analytic.
Okay, so not true by definition.
Right. So there's more to it.
So it's not just wordplay.
Right. It's not just wordplay.
There's something else going on.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
it's not just that we define abstract objects this way, and that's all there is to it.
Okay.
There's something else going on.
There's something more to the object.
Right. There's something more to the object, yeah.
Okay.
So he introduces this idea of the sufficiency operator,
Okay.
which is a way of capturing
Uh-huh.
this notion that one statement can be conceptually sufficient for another
Okay.
without them meaning the exact same thing.
Yes.
Yeah. So for instance, the statement, these two lines are parallel,
Uh-huh.
is sufficient for the statement they have the same direction,
Okay.
but they don't mean the same thing.
Right, there's a gap there.
There's a gap, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's this conceptual gap
Uh-huh.
between the concrete relationship, the lines being parallel,
Right.
and the abstract object that it specifies.
And that's where he locates the thin but real
Yeah,
existence.
exactly. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So he draws this distinction between thin objects
Uh-huh.
and thick objects. So thin objects like, directions, numbers,
Right.
they don't demand anything more from reality
Okay.
than the concrete things that specify them.
So they exist in virtue
They exist in virtue
as
of...
concrete things.
Exactly, yeah.
And the relationships.
And the relationships between them.
Right.
Thick objects, like your coffee cup,
Yeah.
are more demanding. They need to be made of stuff,
Right.
occupy space.
They've got more going on.
They've got more going on, exactly.
So thinness is kind of like a measure
Yeah, it's like a measure.
of how much it depends on the concrete world
Exactly.
to exist.
And so abstract objects are these ultimate minimalists.
Yeah.
Right. They exist, but they exist.
They're wispy?
They're wispy, they're insubstantial,
Yeah.
they're grounded in these possibilities, these conceptual relations.
It's a really interesting way to picture it.
It is, yeah. So
Yeah.
he takes this even further.
Okay.
He argues that they not only have this thin existence,
Right.
but they also have what he calls a shallow nature.
A shallow nature. Okay, does that mean they're superficial?
No, not at all.
Not philosophically interesting?
No, not at all. So
Okay.
what he means by shallow nature is that all of the essential questions you might have about this abstract object can be answered just by looking at its specifications.
Okay, by looking at the concrete.
Okay. The concrete things that specify them, the relations between them. So,
Yeah.
for instance, if you want to know whether two directions are perpendicular,
Yeah.
all you have to do is look at the lines that specify them.
Right, and see if those lines are perpendicular.
Exactly. So
It's like, so the concrete is like a blueprint
it is like a blueprint, yeah.
for the abstract world.
Exactly.
But then does that make them seem less real?
That's a good question, and that's one of the challenges that Linnenby's view faces.
Okay.
So some people argue that this can't account for the full richness
Okay.
of, say, mathematical practice, where
Right.
mathematicians seem to explore these abstract objects that go beyond what can be captured by just these simple specifications.
So maybe the abstract world isn't just a shadow of the concrete.
Right, exactly.
Maybe it's got its own thing going on.
Yeah, maybe it's got its own
Yeah.
internal logic and structure.
Yeah, interesting. So,
And that speaks to this ongoing mystery, right?
Yeah.
Even with these sophisticated ways of characterizing these objects,
yeah.
we're still left with some really deep philosophical puzzles.
It seems like the more we illuminate one part of the abstract landscape,
Right.
new shadows pop up.
Exactly. And that leads us
Yeah.
to a group of philosophers who they're so perplexed by these shadows
Yeah.
that they want to do away with the distinction altogether.
Okay.
So these are the eliminativists.
The eliminativists.
Yeah, and their views are pretty radical,
Yeah.
but also, I think, really thought-provoking.
So we've been on this journey, right? Trying to define abstract objects, figure out how they relate to the concrete world,
Yeah.
make their existence a little less demanding with this idea of thinness.
Right.
But now we're talking about eliminativists.
Yeah.
These are philosophers who think we should just get rid of the whole distinction.
That's right.
Abstract concrete, just scrap it.
Yeah, it might seem drastic,
It does.
but I think their arguments are worth taking seriously, especially given all the difficulties we've seen.
Right, all the challenges.
Exactly, in trying to make this distinction work.
So what are the different flavors of eliminativism, so to speak?
Yeah, good question. So one type is what's called nominalism.
Nominalism, okay.
And nominalists, they're really hardcore. They not only deny that abstract objects exist,
Right?
they deny that there's any meaningful distinction between abstract and concrete at all.
So for them, it's like trying to define a unicorn.
Yeah, right.
We're chasing something that's not even there.
We're just making it up. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So they would look at all these ways we've been discussing,
Right.
and they would say, look, these are all just based on, false assumptions or arbitrary distinctions.
Yeah.
It's just not a real distinction.
Gotcha. Okay, what's another kind?
Yeah, so then you get the real radicals, which are the ontological nihilists.
Okay, ontological nihilism. Wow.
And they deny the existence of any kind of object,
Whoa.
abstract or concrete.
Okay, so the whole universe is just an illusion.
Well, again, it's more nuanced than that. I mean,
Yeah.
they might not deny that we have experiences,
Right.
but they'll say that those experiences don't necessarily correspond to a world of objects out there.
Okay, so it's more like a dream, right? Just this flow of experience. But
Yeah, that's a good analogy, yeah.
Okay, interesting.
And then finally, you have a kind of a more moderate form of eliminativism.
Okay.
And these philosophers might say, look, there are some clear-cut cases,
Okay.
right? We can all agree that rocks are concrete.
Right.
And numbers are abstract. But
Yeah.
when you try to draw a hard line, it just gets too messy.
Okay.
It's no longer really doing any philosophical work.
So they're saying, okay, the easy cases, sure. But once you start getting to the borderline cases,
Right, like impure sets.
yeah, the fictional character,
Yeah, fictional objects, all that kind of stuff.
then it all falls apart.
It just breaks down. Yeah.
Yeah.
The distinction, they would say, is just not
Not useful.
It's not useful, yeah.
So it's like after all of this,
Yeah.
we've tried to define abstract objects. We've tried to, ground them
Yeah.
in the concrete world.
Mhm.
We've made their existence thin,
Right.
and now we're talking about eliminating them. I
Right.
mean, if we just gone down the rabbit hole,
Yeah, it can feel that way.
yeah, and come up empty.
But I think even though we don't have one neat answer,
Okay.
we haven't found the magic formula, I
Yeah.
think the journey has been valuable.
Okay.
We've seen all the complexities.
Uh-huh.
We've uncovered hidden assumptions.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, I think, for a philosopher, just having this kind of deeper awareness of the challenges here.
So it's like we don't have the map of the abstract world,
Right.
but at least we've walked around the terrain.
We've got a better sense of the lay of the land.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So as we're kind of wrapping up this deep dive here,
Yeah.
what's the key takeaway for our listener?
I would say, the next time you encounter abstract objects in your own philosophical work,
Yeah.
think about these ways.
Right.
Think about the challenges.
Uh-huh.
Ask yourself which view resonates with you.
Do you buy into this robust existence, or is it the thin existence?
Right.
Maybe you're an eliminativist.
Maybe you want to get rid of the distinction altogether. Exactly.
And I guess that's the beauty of it, right?
Yeah,
There's not one right answer.
exactly.
It's about this ongoing process
Absolutely.
of thinking it through.
And that's what makes philosophy so fascinating.
Exactly. It's not about finding the one answer. It's about
Right.
continuing to explore.
Yeah, it's about embracing the mystery.
Right, the mystery of the abstract. Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up our deep dive
Yeah.
into the world of abstract objects.
I hope you've enjoyed the journey.
Yeah, keep those philosophical gears turning.